today, we're going to be hearing from clinicians who have been routinely using probiotics with their babies at high risk for necrotizing enterocolitis. But we have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I wanted to mention is I'm asking you to please save the dates. We have a couple of dates we want to remind you of. Monday, May 6th is our third webinar on probiotics, and that's going to cover practical considerations and consent with families. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then I'd also like to invite you to join us for the Necrotizing Enterocolitis Symposium. This is set for June 2nd through 5th of this year, and it's presented by the NEC Society through a partnership with the Section of Pediatric Surgery at the University of Michigan, with the support from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, as well as the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. So I hope you'll join us in June in Ann Arbor, and I will be sure to include the link to registration in the chat box in a moment. I also want to mention that we are expecting registration to sell out because we have just a limited amount of space with our venue size and capacity. So if you're thinking about joining us, I encourage you to register early because we are already beginning to fill up. Webinar is only educational. We're not marketing or promoting probiotics, and probiotics are not currently approved for the prevention of NEC or other neonatal diseases. Just keep that in mind. For those of you who I haven't yet met, here's a photo of my son Micah. Micah was born at 27 weeks gestation, and by the time he was about 6 weeks old, Micah weighed about 5 pounds, was beginning to breastfeed and was stable and healthy. And tragically, Micah developed necrotizing enterocolitis, which resulted in a series of complications, including renal disease, lung disease, liver disease, and short bowel syndrome. Micah came home, but he passed away from those complications of NEC when he was 11 months old. And so about a year after Micah's passing, I founded the NEC Society, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to building a world without NEC. And for those of you who aren't too familiar with the NEC Society, we are, as I said, a nonprofit that brings together patient families, clinicians, and researchers committed to driving research, improving care practices, and raising awareness. And while the NEC Society is based in the US, we're quite proud and honored to have partners around the globe. And I'm really just so amazed by this map. We work hand in hand with partners around the world to prevent NEC, and together we try to do all we can to build a world without this devastating disease. And we're truly honored and grateful to have hundreds of participants from these 22 countries who have registered to join us for our webinars so far. So welcome to the NEC Society, and thank you so much for being part of this community. We're really thrilled and honored to have you. The NEC Society's Probiotics webinar series is made possible with the support of Dr. Mark Underwood from UC Davis and Dr. Ravi Patel from Emory University, and they both serve on the NEC Society's Scientific Advisory Council and help to lead our organization.
I would just like to welcome everybody who's joining this webinar, and thank you for joining it. So my brief job today is to give you a couple of take-home lessons from the previous webinar. So that's what THL stands for. So number one lesson is that intestinal dysbiosis is common in premature babies and plays a central role in the pathogenesis of NEC. So this picture that you see is from two different studies. The top portion from the study by La Rosa and colleagues looks at the intestinal microbiota in premature infants. So this is a big study, 58 premature babies, almost 1,000 samples. And what we see from this slide is that the number of proteobacteria is high in this population, and particularly high between about 27 weeks and 33 weeks. The bottom part of that figure shows you the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis from a huge Canadian study. And so the blue line tells you the gestational age at birth of these babies who develop NEC. And so it's mostly a disease of babies born at less than 33 weeks gestation. The red line is fascinating. It tells you the postmenstrual age, or the corrected gestational age at the timing of NEC. And you see that's mostly between 27 and 33 weeks. So the idea here is to correlate the dramatic dysbiosis that happens in these babies, and that it aligns perfectly with the peak onset. The bottoms are the second take-home lesson is that probiotics decrease the risk of NEC, death, and sepsis in both very low birth weight infants and extremely low birth weight infants. The figure is a cumulative meta-analysis of the studies available up to that time, which showed a dramatic difference in terms of the babies who got probiotics had a lower risk of NEC than the babies who got the placebo in more than 10,000 babies. And the reason we chose this figure is to demonstrate that additional placebo-controlled randomized trials are not likely to change that outcome. So let's go to the next slide. The third take-home lesson, we talked a little bit last time about mechanisms by which probiotics might decrease your risk of NEC or possible mechanisms. And what's been shown in animal studies is that probiotics change the microbiota so that we have fewer gamma proteobacteria and more commensal organisms, that these probiotic organisms can decrease inflammation. The figure shows you one pathway, the TLR4 pathway, that is blocked or inhibited by a variety of different probiotic products, and that probiotics decrease intestinal leakiness or permeability. The final take-home lesson from the first webinar was that we don't have a clear best product choice, meaning we don't know which probiotic, which dose, or whether a combination of probiotics is better than a singular. And that's because we haven't yet done trials comparing doses or comparing products to each other. And then the bottom point is, I think, perhaps the most powerful from the first webinar, and that is that parents are anxious to learn more about necrotizing enterocolitis and about the evidence that demonstrates a decreased risk of NEC with the use of human milk and with probiotics. So parents want to know, they want to have these discussions with us, they want to hear about the data that's available, and we have some resources, particularly an information sheet about the benefits of human milk in preventing NEC and the benefits of probiotics in human milk available at the NEC Society website. Next slide. So today we're going to focus this second webinar on experiences from 4 centers, and we appreciate these wonderful folks from these 4 centers taking time to meet with us today and tell us about their process. How did they decide to use probiotics? How did they decide on which product to use, and what are they seeing so far in terms of either benefit or no benefit or worsening? And so we're pleased to have representatives from the University of Utah, Maggie Saccone and Brad Yoder, and to have representatives from both Northern California, Kaiser Permanente, and Southern California, Kaiser Permanente, Alan Fisher and David Braun, respectively. And then our 4th presentation will be from Ravi Patel, sharing his experience and that of his colleagues at Emory. And so I'm going to turn the time over first to Maggie and Brad from the University of Utah. Each of these experts are going to share what they've done and their process, and then we'll have time at the end for questions and answers from the whole panel. If you want to type in questions now, we'll be tracking those so that we can focus on them, so use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Maggie and Brad.
All right, thank you for that introduction and for this opportunity to present our experience with probiotics at the University of Utah. Like Dr. Underwood mentioned, the necrotizing enterocolitis is multifactorial in its pathophysiology, including factors such as prematurity and immature intestinal epithelial barrier, abnormalities in intestinal perfusion, inflammation, genetics, and immature innate immune response, intestinal dysbiosis, and enteral feeding practices. To target some of these risk factors and reduce rates of NEC in our unit, we instituted an umbilical cord milking protocol in September of 2011. And a pasteurized donor human milk protocol in June 2013. So this graph shows the rates of NEC in infants born at less than 30 weeks gestation in our unit. On the y-axis, you can see rates of NEC greater than or equal to bowel stage 2, and on the x-axis is the years between 2010 and 2015. As a result of these interventions, we had a decrease in rates of NEC from about 20% in 2011 to about 7% in 2014. However, despite good adherence to the cord milking and donor human milk protocols, we saw an uptick in our rate of NEC by 2015 to about 11%. So in 2016, we decided to implement a probiotic protocol to target the risk factor of intestinal dysbiosis. But as Dr. Underwood mentioned, they may also play a role in modulating the immature innate immune system as well as inflammation. So when we implemented our probiotic protocol, we did it in a quality improvement fashion. And so our aim statement for this project was to achieve a 50% reduction in rates of necrotizing enterocolitis greater than or equal to Bell stage 2 by October 2018 in infants born at less than 33 weeks gestation or less than 1,500 grams. To achieve this aim, we developed primary and secondary drivers that really centered around kind of 3 major areas. The first was identifying the correct patients. The second was minimizing adverse events, namely probiotic sepsis. And the third was collecting data on this project. And our protocol really encompassed most of our primary and secondary drivers in that it established specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. We had a protocol to start and stop the probiotic suspension. Nurses had a separate protocol to administer the suspension, and the pharmacy technicians had their own protocol to prepare the probiotic suspension. Our pharmacists were in charge of screening eligible patients and notifying providers on daily rounds, and they also developed a handoff tool to kind of notify themselves or remind themselves to screen infants for probiotics by 72 hours of life. To help with data tracking, we developed an electronic medical record order for the probiotic, as well as a way to detect the order. We also did weekly chart review for compliance and established a system to notify our team lead of positive blood cultures. And finally, we held staff-specific education sessions prior to rolling out our protocol. So there were 2 main factors in choosing the probiotic product, and the first was choosing a product with multiple organisms, and the second was choosing a product that was associated with some quality. So in our unit, we are using Ultimate Flora, and this product has 4 species of bifidobacteria, including Bifidobacterium breve, Bifidum infantis, and longum, and 1 species of lactobacillus, and that's Lactobacillus rhamnosus. 1 gram of the product contains about 4 billion live cultures. There is some quality assurance associated with this product in that it's manufactured in Canada where all probiotics are subject to Natural Health Products Regulation under Health Canada. And this product underwent independent validation of component bacteria at the University of Iowa. In our unit, infants are eligible for the probiotic if they are born at a gestational age of less than 33 and 0.7 weeks or less than 1,500 grams. They must have a postmenstrual age of at least 24 and 0.7 weeks and must be at least 72 hours of age to receive the probiotic. They must also tolerate at least 6 milliliters per day of enteral feedings for 24 hours. And infants with lethal anomalies or conditions or significant gastrointestinal anomalies are excluded from receiving the probiotic. The probiotic is discontinued once infants reach a corrected gestational age of 36 and 0.7 weeks. We had three plan-do study act cycles. The first was education and consensus building, as well as intervention development. The second involved probiotic protocol implementation, which occurred on October 3rd, 2016. And the third cycle was intervention sustainment. Our primary measure was the monthly rate of NEC greater than or equal to Bell stage 2 per 100 patient days. Our process measure was protocol compliance, and our balancing measure was rates of probiotic sepsis. So the data I'm going to present is from October 3rd, 2016 to October 31st, 2018, but we're still using this Ultimate Flora product in our unit and continuing to monitor data. So between that time period, there were 290 infants that received the probiotic. In terms of protocol compliance, there was 1 ineligible patient that received the probiotic, and this baby had a postnatal diagnosis of coarctation of the aorta. 5 eligible patients were missed, but none of these patients were diagnosed with NEC. For our balancing measure, there were no cases of probiotic sepsis. So this graph shows our monthly rate of NEC greater than or equal to Bell stage 2 per 100 patient days. On the y-axis is the rate of NEC per 100 patient days. On the x-axis is the month and year from October 2014 till October 2018. The solid blue line is the rate of NEC per 100 patient days. The dashed red lines are the upper and lower control limits, and the dotted red line is the average rate of NEC per 100 patient days. So again, on October 2016 is when we began our intervention, and at that time, our rate of NEC was 0.14 cases per 100 patient days. By September 2017, so approximately 1 year after protocol implementation, we achieved a rate of 0.02 cases per 100 patient days. But in November 2017 is when we saw our first cases of NEC, and those were 2 cases since starting the intervention. And that left us a rate of about 0.04 cases per 100 patient days by October 2018. Using standard quality improvement rules, or SPS rules, we identified July 2017 as our point of special cause change. And that essentially means our point where we could say that there was a significant decrease in our rate of NEC. We had 5 cases of NEC in the probiotic period between October 3rd, 2016 and October 2018. There were 3 cases of surgical NEC and 2 cases of bowel stage 2 NEC. Of these 5 cases, 3 of the infants were on probiotics at the time of diagnosis of NEC. So from this project, we could conclude that implementation of a probiotic protocol was associated with decreased rates of NEC greater than or equal to bowel stage 2. And the factors we identified that were key to our success included informatics support to build a probiotic monitoring report, having our NICU pharmacist assign the role of patient identification, and then routine monitoring of compliance and adverse outcomes. And thank you again for this opportunity for sharing our experience.
At the time we started talking about it seriously in 2015. And what I wanted to do in this talk is to talk about the challenges of getting a bunch of nurseries to, and a bunch of doctors to come together to find some consensus to move forward. So where we were in 2015 is we're at a place which, just like up north, has about 40,000 deliveries a year, which is about 600 little babies. We have about 13 nurseries we oversee with about 65 doctors who look after them. We have 1 committee, that's good, and all of our places use donor milk, that's good, but back then only 1 place was using probiotics. In 2015, though some of us had been talking about probiotics, really how we got started was the evidence-based medicine group in Kaiser Permanente came to us and said, look at all this great data, how come you're not using probiotics? So that initiated a bunch of discussions over the next few years between the opinion leaders. We had CME sessions, including ones where Mark Underwood was gracious enough to come and answer questions. We had a lot of discussions in our leadership group and a lot of discussions with pharmacy. So the kind of things that come up in those discussions I tried to capture here. So the first ones were around, should we start probiotics at all? What seemed to generate discomfort were the things I listed here, things like, is there enough data to support probiotic use? And I think, and the response was what Mark had shared at the beginning of this talk, that there are literally tens of thousands of patients and dozens of RCTs, and the data is very strong. The next concern was, well, the AAP says we shouldn't be using them until the FDA approves. And discussions around that were actually discussions around the quirks of how the FDA works in this country, that probiotics are not, in the FDA, you can either be a food or a drug, but there isn't sort of an in-between category like there is up north in Canada. So this was a practical obstacle for getting things approved. Another issue was, aren't we just going to be giving kids nosocomial infections from the probiotics or their contaminants, like that one case there have been cases like in the powdered milk where there was some sort of fungus that went across, and there was one probiotic where there, I think, were a case or two of mucor, I think, that occurred. And the answer, the response to that was that actually the overall nosocomial infection rate is lower with probiotics, and that the FDA cases were really case reports. There really wasn't a denominator to them. But it did emphasize the importance of using high quality products. Other fears were that related to high quality products, that we don't, there in this country, there isn't a lot of oversight about the quality of the products that you can buy. I think the response to that is that there have been studies done that characterize the quality of products that can be used to help guide discussions. And as Maggie had pointed out, that there are products you can use from Canada that have the benefit of their oversight. Another point was, well, our NEC rates are already low, and so we've already solved the problem. And then the response to that was, well, lower is always better, and that also there are published studies starting out with our NEC rate, which was running around 3.5%, where they did see a decrease down to 2% or less with the probiotics. So it is possible, even when your rates are low, to get lower. Then the last push was, don't we need another RCT to adopt probiotics into practice? Can we even give these if we're in some standardized way without, isn't that just being arbitrarily changing the standard of care? And that actually got into a really interesting conversation, which I think has been published on, which is that, well, actually, one of the things I raised was that we got a formal legal opinion on that, and the answer is that there's a wide latitude to standard of care, and that if you have a plausible rationale, that it usually will pass muster, at least legally. But I think the more interesting conversation is, most of the care that we do in the United States is completely arbitrary and completely inconsistent. People just do whatever they want, and isn't that a funny way to practice medicine? Why don't we up our game, and as a group do things in an organized way, so that we can really see what's the effect of our interventions in a way that you just can't do when you're just writing the orders that day and somebody's going to do something different the next. The next conversation that came up revolved around, well, if we're going to do probiotics, which probiotic? And there we had in what I thought was an interesting set of conversations about what were going to be the criteria to choose a probiotic. And these were the ones that we came up with, and some things influence things a lot more than you might think. So of course there's things like the product quality, and of the products that we looked at, which are not all the products out there, but the products we looked at, there were some that were clearly of higher quality than others. As far as safety, in terms of the lack of fungal contaminants and things like that, there were also some products that of the ones we were looking at that stood out as being a higher purity. Another issue that was a biggie for a lot of people was to avoid powder. There was the powder issue because the FDA had made a statement mainly around a powdered formula that you'd have to do it, you have to reconstitute it under a hood, and there's all these logistical obstacles that made powders a compliance problem for us. The other thing about powders was that they're inconvenient for the people who have to give them. You have to reconstitute them. You have you have to have a minimum volume. And our nursing group said we would much rather have something we can just squirt into the formula rather than reconstitute. then there were things like efficacy for NEC, and as been pointed out, there isn't really terribly strong data for one over the other, though there's a little bit of a hint of a signal in there. Nosocomial infection efficacy for for their ability to colonize, efficacy in terms of the bugs producing gut trophic metabolites, and all those tended to drift us towards a little bit, actually more towards the B. infantis direction. So in 2017, we went through our first phase of implementation, which is that we all agreed that of the products that were available at the time, that we liked, which were L. reuteri or B. infantis, that since B. infantis wasn't easily available in the form that we wanted, we would start out with L. reuteri, and pending when a liquid form of B. infantis came out. So, and the rationale was that that the L. reuteri was the most appealing at the time, and that also it would be a good way for us to break the ice as a group of nurseries to start using probiotics. So we targeted the little babies and fed them until they were, supplemented them until they were 34 weeks. And the result was that there was a big increase in the use of probiotics, and there weren't any complaints that seemed to arise. And but then also, given also that we were only doing it for a year and we only have 500 kids a year, that we didn't see a significant change in NEC infection, length of stay, or death. So in 2018, Avivo, the B. infantis product that comes as a liquid, became available. And that opened up a big new set of conversations. And the discomfort topics here are listed in this table. So the first thing was, why not continue to use the BioGaia product? Everything's going fine, why change? And so the response was mainly, well has to do with the ease of use, not necessarily that that would be any different with the B. infantis product. The other thing was that BioGaia has efficacy, why change? And the response was, well, hey guys, we all discussed this, and there's and if anything, there may be some evidence for more efficacy in the B. infantis product. Third thing, Avivo wasn't on our formulary and wasn't on contract, so we went through all the trouble of getting it on our formulary, getting it on contract, getting it into our electronic medical record. Another interesting one was that we had pretty heavy marketing by Avivo when they came out, and among the neonatologists, a lot of them found that an issue. They started worrying, are we just doing this because we're caving to marketing? And I think the response that I think won the day was that marketing doesn't mean that the product's worse, it just means that they're marketing. And we did work with the company Evolve Biosystems to decrease their marketing. Another thing, Avivo's much more expensive. Avivo's about $50, $30 to $50 a dose versus if you use the liquid, versus L. reuteri, which is about $2 a dose. So we actually did a cost-benefit analysis, and using the cost of the drugs versus the acute published hospital cost of NEC, and then using the published efficacy data with the single organism meta-analyses between L. reuteri and B. infantis, we found out that it was going to be the same number of dollars for less disease. So that seemed like a good deal. Then the response to that, of course, was, well, the cost-benefit analysis is just theoretical. Why not wait for somebody to do studies so we'll know? And the response to that was, well, studies won't be out for years at least. And why don't we be one of the people to do the studies? That, in fact, getting back to my point a few slides ago, was that we shouldn't be doing inconsistent practice, waiting for people who do consistent practice to see what matters. We should start to do our own consistent practice so that we can contribute, which is basically the point, the last point on this slide. So just a few months ago, we finally came to an agreement that we would use Avivo exclusively for now. And we've decided to use the liquid. We're targeting the little babies. The dose is 1 unit dose, which is I think about 0.5 milliliters a day. The day we dose, when do kids get a dose? Any day they get a feeding of any volume. What days do we not dose? Any day they don't get a feeding. And we stop dosing after 34 weeks. We stopped there mainly as part of the cost analysis. If you carry on for a few more weeks, you add a lot more dollars and maybe not getting that much return in terms of decreased NEC. Though I wonder whether maybe we should be pushing it out another few weeks. And then we also had an agreement about how long we do this before we decide whether or not to declare victory or defeat. And we did a power analysis that we would need to do about 2,000 babies, which would be about 4 years for us, to have enough power to pick up the rate of drop of NEC that we were hoping to see. So there's been a commitment to go for 4 years. So far, what we've seen is implementation data. We looked at it 2 ways. We first looked at implementation by baby, and over the last few years, you can see that starting in 2017, we went from roughly 0 to 40%. That was our El Reuterai year. And in 2018, which is the turnover year, we were already up to 68%, and hopefully we'll get a lot higher this year. The 2019 data obviously is very incomplete. We've also been tracking, because through the wonders of the electronic medical record, you can do this, is we actually track dosing by eligible day, not just by eligible baby, because for this to really work, you really need to colonize the kids. So we've been able to track the compliance with that, and each of those curves is a different nursery, and the dotted line is the total set of babies, and the total set of eligible days. And what this looks like to me is in the months since we started using the Avivo product, our rate of compliance has gone up to nearly 100% in most of our nurseries. There's 1 or 2 that are at least in the 70-ish% range. And there's one place that still has yet to implement. They're still a bit on the fence. So we're still working with them. So that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We'll go ahead with Ravi's presentation.
Thank you all. Can you see my screen okay, Mark?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. So I wanted to share some of our experiences at Emory with the routine use of probiotics, and to provide some context, in 2013, we had a NEC incidence of 15% in very low birth weight infants. This was based on the Vaughan definition. And this started to coalesce, I think, around the conversation about efforts to reduce NEC. We had begun the use of donor human milk, and we started the discussions about probiotics, and I think in November of 2013, when the ProPrems trial, which we discussed on the last webinar, was published. This was a large randomized trial in Australia and New Zealand. I think this really was a turning point in terms of our center's decision to begin routine probiotic supplementation as part of overall QI efforts to prevent NEC. And I think the important was this was one of several things that we did to try to reduce NEC. And similar to what Dr. Sekhan presented earlier, we targeted really multiple drivers with a goal to reduce the incidence of NEC from 15%, which was in 2013, down to 5% by 2018. And there are multiple drivers, and I think the probiotic supplementation was really targeting the driver of dysbiosis. And we measured many of these factors over time in our nursery. We had decreases in acid suppression use, had reached about 100% of our infants as a median received any human milk use in the last quarters, and that was largely through the introduction of donor human milk. We had a really high compliance with the feeding protocol and fairly good adherence and uptake of probiotic therapy. The majority of eligible infants were receiving probiotics. And our choice of the probiotic, we began using Culturelle, and that's a Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG product. And that was largely driven by the product being available in our formulary and it being a single dose packet in kind of collaboration with our pharmacist about being able to dispense this through the pharmacy. And so the practicalities of the product were really what drove our initial use and choice of using LGG. And we began in February of 2014 with routine LGG supplementation. This is a statistical process control chart by quarter, looking at quarterly period and the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis. And the dotted lines are kind of the upper control limits. And so in 2013, you can see this point above the red dotted line. That was the period where we had special cause and kind of an increase, relatively abnormal increase in NEC. But this was in the setting of a overall relatively high incidence of NEC. And since implementation in 2014, we did not observe any declines when we began supplementation using kind of special cause rules, statistical rules in the incidence of NEC by quarter. We also looked at, just by comparison, looking at EPIC before we began routine LGG implementation and after LGG implementation, looking here now specifically at modified Bell staging of NEC. And in the EPIC before, our incidence was 10%, and in the EPIC after was 17%, and that was actually a significant increase. No difference in the incidence of stage 3 NEC. We also saw no association between LGG implementation and sepsis, blood culture positive sepsis, but also had no cases of probiotic sepsis, which we tracked closely through this initiative. And so this was, I think, our experience. We, as you saw on and you've heard other discussions by the other speakers, I think it's important to think about the other drivers and what we really have been wondering when we looked. About 80% of our infants received antibiotics and 40% received prolonged antibiotics, and whether, to try to address prolonged empiric antibiotic use has been really where we've been focusing over the last couple of years. And we struggled with the finding of no reduction in NEC after a couple of years. Could this be just a function of random error, other changes in our population? And weighing that against all of the data that we presented on the last webinar, both from randomized trials and cohorts routinely using probiotics, and that we still felt confident this was just a single center's experience, but weighing that against all of the data, that we changed to using a liquid preparation that contains Lactobacillus reuteri that you heard Dr. Braun talk about. And we did that last year after kind of reconvening with our team. And we're continuing to track our incidents and follow that. And I think our experience highlights some of the uncertainty regarding the effect of probiotics in different populations, and particularly some of the co-treatments that occur, such as antibiotic use. And I think there's not a lot of data about kind of the interaction between antibiotic exposure and use in probiotics. And also some of the uncertainties regarding specific products. But in the end, it was really weighing both the single strain meta-analysis supporting Lactobacillus reuteri and our persistent challenge with NEC at our institution that led us to make the change, and we plan to track this going forward. And so that's our experience, and I think we're going to move to the Q&A session.
I see there is a question, a couple questions on the Q&A tool, if you guys want to check that out.
I think the first question is by Jim Soltz, and it's about how might the FDA approval of a probiotic for NEC prevention impact your use of unapproved probiotic supplements, considering there may be a significant cost difference. The approved product may be in formulary. And I do think that there's one trial that is underway looking at a product that's going for a indication for prevention of NEC. And I do think that for some centers that is going to be one limiting step is really wanting to have a product that's approved. I do worry, as you've seen the experience of several centers and reports in the US about declining incidence of NEC, about these trials being able to show an effect on NEC unless they're able to enroll large numbers of infants. And I think it's hard to know what will occur until we can get a sense of what the cost would be and the product and the data from those trials. If other folks on the other panelists have any thoughts?
This is Alan Fisher. I think that NEC as an endpoint is clearly an important one, and one that we're focused on at this presentation today. But there's a whole totally unexplored world of the impact of dysbiosis on long-term outcomes, and I think that has to be understood much better before you could do any kind of a cost-effectiveness analysis. I mean, absolutely, NEC is an important endpoint, and even a low incidence of NEC is incredibly costly, and that's not even taking into account the human cost, but just the cost to the medical system. And I think that to do a thorough analysis of what somebody might consider to be an expensive product, you have to look at longer term endpoints.
This is Mark Underwood. I see a question from Dr. Kleiman. To all speakers, have you separated the effects of your probiotic choice separately on NEC and whatever you define as spontaneous intestinal perforation? I think that's a very important point. As you all know, there are cases of spontaneous ileal or intestinal perforation that occur almost always in the first days of life, and most commonly in the very small babies. And so one of the big questions for the field is, how do we settle on a diagnosis of NEC, and should we be using the Bell's criteria, or should we be working towards a better definition? And I think there's general agreement that a better definition would be very helpful, and that definition would have to include some way to exclude cases of SIP. So clearly, if you have a baby who's had either an autopsy or a laparotomy, and you have specimens you can distinguish between the two, it's not always possible to completely distinguish between the two. So for instance, one proposal that has been floated around is when we're reporting these kinds of cases, to separate NEC cases that meet Bell's criteria into typical and atypical cases, to try to help us sort out when we're seeing an effect and when we're not. And atypical would include those babies who have NEC who've never been fed, or those babies who have NEC in the first 10 days of life, or some have proposed excluding cases of NEC in premature babies once they're past 36 weeks gestation, because clearly those are not the typical pathogenesis. I think all of those are valuable ways to look at data carefully. So I applaud, for instance, Maggie's table where she shows each case of NEC, and you can look at it and see, does this look like a typical case or an atypical case? Dr. Kleiman's second comment was, how have they affected the ELBW group, not just the VLBW group? And I think that's a very pertinent question. As you all know, some of the early studies that were smaller did not show benefit in the babies who were born at less than a kilo, and the predominant benefit seemed to be in the babies between 1 and 1.5 kilos, in part perhaps because they were the largest number of babies in many of those trials. As we discussed in the first webinar, I think the largest study to include and separate babies out by birth weight is the group from Germany that did a very large observational cohort study. And when they looked at their ELBW babies, they found a significant decrease in the incidence of NEC. And I think it really only appeared because they had such a high N. And so I think as we're trying to look at these data from large institutions that have more and more ELBW babies, that will be very valuable to include those data to see how different that group really is. And then Dr. Kleiman's third question was, can you review the results of the NEC CIP outcomes from the randomized controlled trials that have used probiotics in infants who are only taking exclusive human milk? And again, I think that's such a valuable point. The studies that have been analyzed in that way have more commonly showed that probiotics are more effective in babies that are receiving human milk than in babies that are receiving formula. The remaining questions, of course, are differences between mom's own milk and donor human milk, which is pasteurized, and the difference between bovine-based fortifiers and the quote-unquote all-human diet data. And unfortunately, I think numbers for both of those questions are still very low. And so as we get more experience and as more observational studies are published, dividing those infants out into these subgroups will be particularly important.
This is David Brandy, just thinking about the need for large studies, just to reemphasize basically my plea to the neonatal community that for these low frequency events like NEC and for us to really understand the effects of things on a scale that of intervention that would allow us to actually see the signal to noise ratio be good, we really need pragmatic trials. I think this is way beyond the scale that you can do with an RCT, at least in this country. And there are opportunities with the registries like VON and CPQCC, where in principle people could basically enter what they're doing with their patients to see the effects over time, and if individual nurseries or individual registries could identify practices we want to track, we might be able to pick up a signal in a way that we wouldn't be able to anywhere as soon in other ways. I'd like us to be like the oncology people, where people across the country are putting their people into protocols and entering them into registries, and they move their field along really fast. And I'd love to do something like that in neonatology.
So I see a question here from David Kaufman. Do probiotics add to data if one is using an all-human milk diet? And I think, again, that David Braun's point is we don't have nearly enough numbers to address that question, much less the question of whether the all-human diet decreases NEC compared to bovine fortifiers. So those are both, I think, points that really underscore the importance of David Braun's comment. I think the more data we collect, the more capacity we'll have to answer these kinds of questions. And I might just pause and say that this webinar will be available on the NEC Society website. The first webinar is also available there. And there's also a tab there for clinicians that describes a quality improvement probiotic product. The idea there is to try to gather data in a low-cost way from centers who have decided to use a probiotic. We would love to have you share those data. If we have 100 NICUs sharing their data from before and after they start probiotics, and particularly if they provide that level of detail about diet, that I think will help us gather more information. We would like to make that process of data collection easier, and so using current registries like the VAUGHN or CPQCC or other state databases may help facilitate sharing, which I think would be valuable.
And Mark, I wanted to just add a comment about human milk. I do think that when you think about drivers and ways to reduce NEC, I think that is probably one of the most important interventions is the use of human milk. But in the majority of studies that have looked at human milk, although there's a reduction with NEC, it doesn't still eliminate NEC. And I do think there's biologic plausibility for the interaction between probiotics and human milk oligosaccharides and other components that support the benefits of both. But as we've seen declining NEC rates in the United States based on several studies coinciding with the increases potentially in human milk, I do think there's still a persistent number of infants that do develop NEC.
I agree completely.
Zalin, in Northern Cal Kaiser, we're heavy users of both bank breast milk and maternal breast milk. Where our NICUs are kind of split on, I guess what Dr. Underwood referred to as an all-human regimen versus using bovine fortifier. And when you look at the individual nurseries that use one versus the other, it's hard to discern any difference in pattern of NEC between the two of them. All of our units are actually, as you know, quite low, somewhere around 3.5%. Nobody's 1% consistently.
Oh, this is David Bond. There was a question from Jonas Restad about the safety, pointing out the concern that there wasn't much said about the safety aspects of probiotic use, about contamination and agent-specific sepsis. If I understand the question, I think maybe Dr. Underwood could respond better than I could, but to that.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. So we have here at UC Davis looked at a lot of over-the-counter probiotic products, and the majority of the ones available in the US, if you look carefully at the label and then you look carefully at what's in the product, they don't always match up. We find products where what's in the product isn't on the label and vice versa. We haven't found products that had significant levels of pathogens, but that certainly can happen. On a bigger picture, when I hear people say we don't have safety data about probiotics, I think when we look at the outcomes people have looked at, like days to full enteral feeding, days of hospitalization, in addition to such safety outcomes as late onset sepsis, necrotizing enterocolitis, and death, when we look at outcomes like growth, we don't find any evidence that probiotic products are unsafe. So in other words, the overall picture is that the randomized controlled trials and the observational cohort studies, when we pool them, the risk of NEC, death, and late onset sepsis is less. The ones that have looked at growth have not found a significant difference, so we can't make a case for saying if we give these babies probiotics, they will grow better. But the markers of feeding intolerance, days to full enteral feeding, and days of hospitalization are less. Meta-analyses have looked at the incidence of BPD and retinopathy of prematurity and IVH and found no difference between the groups who got probiotics and didn't get probiotics. So I think we have a good bit of evidence that probiotics in general are safe based in premature babies based on the literature we have available. I see another question from Beth Schinkel about a study in the US comparing the microbial profile of human milk-fed babies who have not developed NEC versus babies who did develop NEC. I think that's a valuable question. So in the US, there have been several studies looking at the microbiota and how it changes in premature infants. And you know how hard that is. What they've got to do is collect fecal samples from premature babies, put them in the freezer, and then based on whether a baby developed NEC or didn't develop NEC, you can look backwards and try to find matched time points and compare the microbiota. And a meta-analysis of those studies have demonstrated that prior to the onset of NEC, there's a higher number of proteobacteria and a lower number of firmicutes and Bacteroides in those babies who go on to develop NEC compared to the babies who don't develop NEC. Beth's question is, can we have those same data for babies who just get human milk? And that I have not seen yet. The closely associated question is, how does human milk feeding affect the microbiota? And the short answer is, primary driver of the microbiota in premature infants is not their delivery type, C-section versus vaginal, or their feeding type, formula versus mom's milk, like it is in term babies. It really is gestational age. And so the immaturity of their intestinal immune response and the colonizing bugs in a given NICU seem to be important drivers. That's not to say that we can't change the composition of the microbiota with probiotics or with human milk feeding. We can, but it's not a huge impact like it is in the term baby. I don't know if any of the other speakers have anything they'd like to add to that question.
I thought you were going to say that in the NICU's scenario that the big driver is antibiotic use.
Well, I do agree with that statement. So I made my statement about gestational age based on that study from St. Louis. LaRosa was the first author, and that group found that corrected gestational age had a greater impact than any of the other factors. But I think you know, these Northern California antibiotic use data are very compelling. In the studies that we've done at UC Davis, we do see that that formula versus human milk feeding does have an impact, not a dramatic one. Which probiotics seems to matter. So what we found was that the probiotics that are best at consuming HMOs were better able to change the microbiota than the probiotics that can't consume human milk oligosaccharides. The impact on antibiotics is dramatic. You can see a change within days of starting an antibiotic. Once you stop the antibiotic, it takes a while, but they typically do go back to their baseline. But I think all of those are important drivers, but at least the data we have from large studies, much bigger than what we've done at UC Davis, say that gestational age matters as well.
So there was a question regarding feeding tolerance and length of hospital stay. So we are collecting kind of sort of a surrogate of feeding tolerance. We're looking at days to reach 120 per kilo enteral feeds, and then our overall TPN days, as well as TPN days in the first couple weeks of life. And then we're collecting length of stay data as well. So in looking at just the PLBW group, we have not found a significant difference in our TPN days. There was maybe a little bit longer to achieve the 120 per kilo feeds in our probiotic implementation period, but that's also when we implemented a feeding protocol. And then our length of hospital stay hasn't changed at all. And then along with this, we are collecting just cost data on kind of a pre and post intervention, what was the difference and even savings related to probiotic use and a reduction in our NEC rates.
I see a question from Julia about dosing, and I think it's a valuable question. We have very little data about what's the appropriate dose. Most of the doses that people used are based on previous studies where they chose a dose for reasons that are not totally clear. So I think what's the right dose probably varies depending on which bug we use. And so it's not going to be simply a matter of saying whichever probiotic we use, we need to give at least 100 million or at least 1 billion or at least 2 billion. The comparisons looking between studies at dose have been difficult to interpret. I think the only dose escalation study I know of is one we did here, where we started babies on the smallest dose we found published in the literature, and then we we tripled the dose every week until we reached the maximum dose reported in the literature. We did that with 2 different probiotics. And in one, the dose didn't seem to matter. Our outcome was colonization, not NEC, obviously. And even at very high doses, that particular probiotic didn't end up in the stool consistently. It didn't colonize well. The other probiotic, once we got up to 1 billion organism, that's when we saw maximum colonization. But as you all know, colonization is only a surrogate endpoint. We think it's valuable to be colonized with healthy commensal organisms because that means fewer pathogens in the gut, but we don't have clear evidence of a direct link between a given dose and a decreased risk of NEC or sepsis or death.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, when you talk about dose, what is your goal? If your goal is to colonize the gut in a sustained way, you know, some of the probiotics just won't colonize no matter what you do. Others, especially in the setting of human milk diet, will colonize even at relatively low doses. So, and it's not clear that colonization is the desired endpoint. So I think there's just a lot of question there and a lot of opportunity to look further.
I do think when you look at the trial data, that most trials have used a dose between 1 to 5 billion coliform units per day. And what is, there's a measure to see how different the effects are across trials, a measure of something called heterogeneity or statistical heterogeneity, and they're relatively consistent. So I think even though there's been, at least based on the trial data, a large number of trials and in different populations with different products, that the findings haven't shown a lot of heterogeneity or differences in effects when you look at that in the 40 or so trials that have been done to date.
Yeah, and one of the things that this suggests that there is a risk of probiotic-induced bacteremia that really has not been demonstrated with now thousands and thousands of babies. But it's important to remember these are babies with intact intestines. At least they haven't been cut on. They don't have abnormalities or malformations. If you look at the literature in terms of case reports related to probiotic-induced bacteria, the vast majority of them occur in patients who have had disturbed bowel. In other words, babies with NEC that has been surgically operated upon or some type of other intervention for atresias or whatnot. And that's a different type of patient. And I don't think there's any evidence at all. There's no data that we know of to answer whether probiotics are safe in that type of patient.
Though it isn't to say that they aren't safe either.
There's no data to say that they are safe. And if we don't have data to say that they are safe, then I think we can extrapolate to say that they may be safe.
Yeah, it's ambiguous.
Well, I would like to thank all of our presenters and especially the NEC Society for this forum. And I would remind you that we have a third webinar coming up in May that I think is going to be very exciting. It's going to address some of the practical aspects of what does consent and assent mean, and how do we best bring parents into this conversation. So I hope you all join us again for the third webinar in May.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.